Washington State University. Go Cougs!
Welcome back to the course on collecting smartphone sensor data using iOS. In part 2 of the first module, we'll be looking at Xcode. Xcode is the main development environment for building our iOS apps. And in a minute, we will start it up and take a closer look. But you can see down here a screenshot of the main Xcode interface. One of the powerful features of Xcode is the storyboard, which is a visual editor for designing the interface to our apps. And in fact, the screenshot shows the storyboard section of Xcode. Another powerful feature of Xcode is the iOS simulator, which simulates most of the functionality of a real device and makes our testing more efficient. But we'll also see how to connect an actual device to Xcode and run the app on the device. So let's go over to the desktop and start up Xcode and take a closer look. So I'll click on the Xcode icon at the bottom here, and you'll see the Xcode menu across the top. To start with, we're going to start building our sensor app, and so I'm going to create a new project and we'll get started on that. So to do that, I click on File, and New, and Project. And right away we see some of the options available for the different types of projects. We'll be doing a single view application, but as you can see, there are many other application types we could start off with. We can also choose different platforms so if I wanted to do an app that works on the phone and the watch, then I could use the watchOS and build a WatchKit app. But for now, we'll stick with iOS and build our app for the iPhone. And again, it's just going to be one view where we see all of the sensor values. So I will start with a single view application. Next, we'll give our app a name, and I'll call it the sensor app. And you can see the team and organization information here. Of course, for me, it's Washington State University, but it will likely be different for you. Next, we can choose the language we want to program in. We could, of course, choose Objective-C, which is the older language used for building iOS apps. But today, the default language is Swift, so we will be using the Swift language. Also, I can target specific devices like just the iPhone or just the iPad, or I can design a universal app that works on both. And so we'll choose that option. These other options here, core data is if I want to add code to the app to initialize a database to store data on the device. And then I can also do testing as I'm building my app. But we're not going to be using those at this point, so we'll leave those unchecked. So when I click Next, I then choose the location of the folder that will hold the files for my app, and I'm just going to put that on the desktop. Also, if you are familiar with repositories like GitHub, you can actually host the code, the files, on a GitHub repository, and Xcode will connect to that and maintain the files there. But for now, we're just going to leave the files on our local Mac machine. So I'll go ahead and create the app. You'll see it creates a folder over here that has the various files of our app in it. Those files are also listed over here in the file hierarchy portion of Xcode. So when we click on the main top level folder for the sensor app, we see the properties of the app in the middle. And so we already saw the identity of the app, the name that we gave it, the team that is developing the app, and the target for the app, in this case a universal device, where we allow different orientations if we rotate the device. And then in general on Xcode, the right panel over here will show various attributes relevant to what we see in the middle here. So we'll look at that a little closer later. So let's go through some of the components of an app. The first Swift file here is called the app delegate. And so if we take a look at the code inside the app delegate, these are basically the main functions that are run when your app starts up or when it changes state. So the very first function as your app starts up is this one here, application did finish launching with options. And in here we can do various one-time initializations for our app. If while the app is running it were to say you received a phone call or some other notification, you may want to briefly address that, say answer the phone call. And so in that case, the app will resign but still remain active. And so this function will be called so that you can make whatever changes are necessary to prepare for that state transition. And then down here, when the app comes back after being inactive and now active again, then this function is called so you can restore the state as needed. If the user were to actually leave the app and say go into another app, then the app will enter the background, and just before that happens, this function will be called again so you can clean up things as necessary. And then when the user comes back to the app, the will enter foreground function will be called here. And again, here you can reinitialize data or elements of the view to prepare for re-entering the app. And then finally, if the app is actually terminated, then the will terminate function is called again so you can clean things up before your app is terminated. So this is the app delegate class, and it is the main entry point for your app. Next, we have the view controller.swift. So every view, an app can consist of multiple views, and every view has a view controller. So initially we just have one view, we have one view controller file, but as we get more complicated apps and additional views, you'll probably have several different view controller files and classes to control those views. When a view is loaded up, the first function that's called here is the viewDidLoad function, and this is where you will initialize elements of the view itself, and we'll be using this to initialize our app as well as we go further into it. If the device were to be low on memory, you may receive this did receive memory warning function call, which would allow you to reduce the memory resources of your app if you can. These days devices have so much memory that this is rarely used, but if your app uses a lot of memory, you may want to respond to this function call and clean things up a bit. Alright, so let's head over to the storyboard. When I click on the main storyboard file here, this actually contains the information of the storyboard. And as you can see right now, it just consists of a single view. And if we expand the elements of this view a little bit, we'll see the various components. So the view itself has various attributes. Again, this right panel over here lists the attributes of what we see in the middle. And then this palette along the bottom here are the various things that we can drag into our view in order to build the interface to our app. So we'll come back to that in a second. Again, over here we see the various parts of the view. For example, the top layout guide is this top margin. This is normally where your phone will display information, say the battery, the carrier, number of bars, and so forth. So we generally don't want to overwrite this area. So most of the things we'll add to our app will be just below that. The bottom layout guide is the actual bottom of the screen at this point, but you may have seen some apps that have, say, a menu down here to allow you to navigate to different pages. So that bottom layout guide would change in that case. But for now, we'll just leave it at the bottom of the screen. And there are various other things, components of our view I won't go into right now. We'll go into some of them a little bit later as we get into our app. Before we start adding some elements to our storyboard, let me cover the rest of the files over here. So the assets file usually contains the image assets for our app. Some apps use lots of images, especially games. In our case, the only image assets that are available are the icons that would be displayed at various points, say on the home screen of the device. For now, we're going to leave these blank, and iOS will be fine with that. It'll just give us a generic icon for our app, but this is where you would drag in various images in order to change that. The launch screen is actually another storyboard, but it has a special function, and that is that when your app starts up, this is the first screen that's displayed to the user. So you want the screen to load very fast and generally give some information about, say, an image or the name of the app or the name of your company, so that the user can see that while your app is loading. Most apps load pretty fast, but if yours it takes a while, then you may want to add something here to the launch screen. And finally, the info plist or property list. This stores various properties of our app. As you can see, things about its name, its version, and so forth. We will be adding some properties to our app a little later, especially as we start to access the sensors. We'll have to add some properties to allow us to do that. But these are the where we would add those properties just by clicking the plus. We'll be able to add some more properties, but we'll do that later. Lastly, in this products, this is where the executable of your app is built and stored. We generally don't have to worry about that, so we'll just leave that one collapsed. All right, so let's go back to the storyboard. So again, this is where we'll build the interface to our app. And as I mentioned, we have this palette of things that we can put in. The first thing we're going to do is add a title to the top of our app. And so generally to add text to the view, you would use a label. And so I'm going to click and drag the label in. And you'll see that the storyboard kind of gives me some guidance as to where to place this, say centering it, not getting it too close to that top layout guide so that we don't overwrite it. And generally it's good to follow those guidelines. So I'm going to put the label right there in the center and up against the top layout guide. And then you can see over here in the attribute inspector the various attributes of this label. For example, the font, the color, and so forth. So we can change those if we want. For now, I'm just going to change the text in that label to the name of our app. So I'll put sensor app in there. And you can see that it did change the label to sensor app, but the box is a little bit too small for it. So I'm going to get the box a little bigger here. It's not quite centered yet, but we'll work on that in a second. Okay, so at this point, let's go ahead and run the app. Now, first we're going to run it in the simulator, and that the run buttons are up here in the upper left. So if I click on this button, it shows me the various simulators I can run. So as you can see, we have iPad, iPhone, the various iPhones. So you can run your app on different types of devices and see how it looks on those different devices. Eventually, to run it on an actual device, that device would show up here. I haven't connected my phone yet, so we don't see it, but I'll add that in a second. But for now, let's stick with the default iPhone 7 Plus and go ahead and run our app. So here's the icon down here for the simulator. Go ahead and click on that so we can see it loading up. Okay, so there's our sensor app loading, and there's the label that we added up there. You can see that it's a little off center, and again, we'll fix that in a second. But while we're in the simulator, let's look around a little bit. So again, the simulator is a pretty good simulation of an actual device. So in fact, if I go over here under hardware, I can simulate hitting the home button, and that takes me to the home screen. So here's our sensor app icon. And as you can see, the simulator has several of the components that come with an actual device, like some of the default apps like calendar and photos. It has most of the general settings for the device, and so we can set those and see their effect on our app. So let me go back to the home screen and I'll swipe over and start up our app again. Another thing we can do in the simulator is simulate the orientation of the device. So again, under hardware, you see I can rotate the device left or right. I can also do this from the keyboard using the command arrow keys. So let me choose rotate left. And again, you'll see our label is even further out of center and not quite up against the top layout guide as we'd like. So we'll see how to fix that in a second. Let me hit command right arrow, and that'll get our orientation back to the portrait mode. Okay, so let's exit our app by hitting the stop button over here. And let's see how we can center this label. So in terms of positioning elements on our view, the main buttons we're going to be using down here are these layout constraint buttons. So this one here allows us to align a label or an element. This adds other sorts of positioning constraints. This allows us to stack elements on top of each other, and this allows us to clean up any problems, any inconsistencies in the constraints. So for now, I'm going to center this label, and that I'll do in the alignment constraints. You'll see these two that are enabled down here. This is horizontal center and vertical center. So I'm going to choose to center it horizontally and add that constraint. And so you can see that it reduced the size of the box to be just big enough for the label, and of course centered it. Like this blue line indicates that it's centered. But it did turn the box red, which means that we're missing a constraint. We also see the red arrow over here. If we click on that, we'll see our problem is that we're missing a constraint. And that constraint is the vertical constraint. It doesn't know where to put it vertically. So for the vertical constraint, we're going to add a constraint to our element. And as you can see, the element is kind of represented in the middle here, and we can add constraints along all four sides of this element. In this case, we just want to add a constraint at the top, which is to position the label up against the top layout guide. And that's actually what it's already by default provided for us. So you can see the check mark here, it's saying that this label is going to be 8 points below the top layout guide. And that's generally a good place to put it. So we'll click on this kind of faded red line, and it'll become solid. So that's saying we're constraining the area above this label to be 8 points below the top layout guide. And so we'll add that constraint, and we see that the red box goes away. The label is properly positioned with its constraints. So now let's run the app again. and see if that fixed our layout problems. So now you see that the label is nicely centered and up at the top of the view. And if I were to rotate the view using the command arrow, even in the landscape mode, once again, the label is properly positioned at the top and centered. So I'll stop the simulator again. And so the layout constraints are very powerful for making sure that the elements on our view are properly laid out, whether despite what device we're using or what orientation we're in. Okay, so next let's actually run this app on an actual device. So I'm going to connect my iPhone to the Mac here I'm using. And now when we look at the various options for simulators to choose, we now see an actual device up here. So this is my iPhone. So I'm going to click on that, and now we'll run the app on the actual device, and eventually you'll see it come up here. There. So I don't know if you can see the sensor app up at the top there. If I rotate it, it'll rotate and still be up at the top and centered, just like in the simulator. So that's how we run our app on an actual device. Again, usually we run it in the simulator till we get it pretty much correct, and then we test it out on various devices. Okay, so that's a brief overview of Xcode. Now I'm going to get out of Xcode and go back into our notes for a second. So again, Xcode is the main development environment for building our apps. It's a very powerful tool for doing that. But to add more to our app, we will be adding more to the storyboard, but we also are going to have to attach some code to the various elements so that they'll behave the way we want. And to do that, we're going to have to learn a little bit more about Swift. So in the next part, we'll give a brief overview to the Swift language.